The MPTF Media Center presents the international premiere podcast of Mystery Theater Audibles, Blackfire, a science fiction fantasy novel written and narrated by Anthony Lawrence, directed and produced by Madeline Smith Lawrence, produced by Jennifer Clymer, sound engineered by Marcus Murrieta.
Chapter 104. It all came to a stop just before they got to the lobby doors that led outside the casino. At first, there had been that slight commotion caused by the woman who had reacted to Charlie Famous having a human arm. It was still very early in the morning, and only a few hard cases were still moving about. She had been urging her somewhat exhausted husband toward just one last fling at roulette. She was somewhat startled at the sight of a slot machine leading a small boy toward the doors that led outside, but what really shocked her was that the machine appeared to be holding the boy with a human arm. She had screamed and tried to tell her husband what she had seen, but he thought she was just having some sort of delusion brought about by the long hours of gambling. Charlie was beginning to see that his effort to get Cody out of the casino was running into problems. Right after the encounter with the woman, he drew the boy into a shadowy alcove where they could not be seen too easily. Cody was becoming even more insistent that he would not leave without his mother. He was struggling harder and harder to pull away from Charlie's grip on his wrist. The boy had begun to cry and call attention to them, and Charlie knew that he was going to have to try another approach to convince the child that he must go along with his plan to get him away from this place. He had always prized logic and truth above all else, and his circuitry was demanding that he confront the necessary conclusions. "Cody, you must listen to me," he began softly in his digital voice, trying to be as gentle as his artificial intelligence would allow. Cody slowly stopped crying and eased up slightly in his struggle as he regarded the machine warily. "I just can't leave my mom." "I understand, but I lied to you, Cody." "What do you mean?" asked the boy, curiosity overcoming his fear for the moment. "I wasn't always a machine." "Well, I kind of got that idea," said Cody, his eyes on Charlie's human arm. "I was a college football quarterback, but I was also a drug addict. Look, I don't care. You're just a part of my dream. I have to get back to my mom, so maybe she can help me wake up." "But you're not dreaming, Cody. I thought it was all a dream." "It's not. It can't be real," Cody insisted as he stared around him at the vast lobby and casino. "But it is. I was invited here, like so many, because I loved playing football, even when I was a boy. But in college, with everyone watching, I couldn't take the pressure anymore and turned to drugs." Charlie's lights flashed wildly, and the buzzing and whirring inside him increased in intensity. "Football, drugs, and cards, all related because they are games, rules, wishes, success, and failure." "Please take me back," Cody urged plaintively. But Charlie continued to hold his wrist, his digital voice almost seeming human in its pathos. "I was desperate to cure my disease before it killed me. I tried everything, but I kept relapsing. It would have meant everything to me, everything to my family. I had nothing to lose. I was wrong. I wagered at table 18 because I thought the real answer to my future, freedom from addiction, not just Super Bowl rings, being famous, but the real answer could only happen by wagering my throwing arm. But I lost. Lost? Cody asked with a good deal of uncertainty. I woke up next morning, and my arm was gone, as if it had never been there. I went back for a second wager, but I lost again and became an employee of the Blackfire Resort and Casino, a one-armed slot machine. Chapter 105. The bullet seemed to go right through his head. No, it didn't seem to. It did go through his head. There was a round, dark hole in the center of his forehead that appeared and then vanished. At almost the same time, the slug entered the wall directly behind him with a loud thud of impact. Under normal circumstances, blood would have appeared at the entry wound and the perp would have been knocked backward from the force. But there was no blood, just a black hole and then nothing. Daniel just kept standing there with that fucking calamine smile and those fierce eyes. Jordan was hidden from my sight because she had crumpled onto the floor after Daniel had waved his arm at her and caused her to scream in pain. I was totally freaked out by now and fired 2 more shots directly at Daniel with exactly the same result. No blood, just black holes that vanished. Then I screamed at him. "Who are you? Are you the fucking devil?" He just stared at me and answered my question with another question. "Are you the fucking god?" "No," I managed to stammer with bitter irony. "But one of his servants did a number on me. Who wanted to kill him? To kill me? Isn't that the province of God?" Before I could even begin to formulate some stupid reply, Daniel's black eyes turned slowly upward. And for a moment, I thought he was about to offer some kind of prayer. But he did not pray, and I don't think he was looking up for some sign of God or any other spiritual entity. There was, however, something in his eyes that I had not seen before. Was it fear? Whatever it was had totally absorbed his attention, and he moved slowly away from the table and around it toward the door. He continued to look upward above him, as if there were something there that he couldn't quite see and was going to find a way to get a better look. It appeared to be something he couldn't see but could sense. It didn't seem to be something inside, but rather outside the casino and way above it. But I could discern by now that it was fear in his eyes, a fear that was a stranger to Daniel, a fear that he had certainly not exhibited when I had fired my Glock directly at his head. He went out the door, and I felt suddenly released from his power. I charged around the table to where Jordan was crumpled on the floor. I grabbed her and pulled her into my arms, brushed the hair back from her ashen face. She opened her eyes and looked up at me, a smile spreading into her lips. Her arms came up around my neck and she held me tight. Her body was warm and very much alive. I knew in that moment, if I didn't know it before, that I loved her, that I had to save her and Cody from Daniel if it took everything I had, including my own life. "Hold me," she whispered. "Just hold me." I had no idea of doing anything else right at that moment. "Will we wake up soon?" she asked, knowing full well that we were not asleep. "I don't want to wake up without you," was about all I could manage to say. "We've got to find Cody." I know. There was only time for the very briefest of kisses. Chapter 106. It loomed silently out of shreds and strings of wispy clouds. The balloon was a large, multicolored rainbow bulb of concentric bands. It hovered and yawed against the azure sky, the morning sun's rays dancing off the sheen. In the basket beneath, Oren clutched another bottle of gin in one hand, and with the other struggled to pilot the lazy vehicle, ignoring the still life hunkered nearby that was once the odious Father Matus. Together, the living and the dead were on their way toward their destiny. They lingered 2,000 feet over the desert floor and drifted closer to the center of the dark city that was the Blackfire resort. Oren's transition to a more evolved life form was almost complete as moonlight cast an eerie amber light on the polished chrome-like surface of his skin. His eyes were like luminous diamonds, and his hair was gone, with his forehead sloping to a symmetrical domed skull. His movements were smooth, but more mechanical now, and for the first time he understood the purpose of his existence. It was to lead the way to new worlds, new life, and knowledge. There would be no pain after he dropped the opal. It would just be a passing from flesh and the knowledge of death to a resonance with the universe. There had been no ground crew to help Oren launch, but he had known exactly how to attach the burner system to the basket by remote control. It was contained in his bag of mind tricks, and despite his downward spiral mentally, he had sent out the messages, and the inflation of the envelope had taken only seconds. Oren had then managed to transport himself and the corpse of the priest instantly to the launch site, his mind cluttered, but still just barely clear enough to know that there was enough air in the balloon. He had then blasted the burner flame into the envelope mouth, heating the air, building pressure until the balloon inflated all the way, and with himself and the dead man aboard, he had released the lines from the ground crew vehicle, fired a steady flame from the burner, and they were airborne. How still it was. The only sound was the occasional hiss from the propane valve and the shriek that rose and fell within Oren's ears. The tinnitus had been his constant companion for such a long time, and often he would simply distract from the noise by popping his ears or using his TM mantra to meditate. But now the sky surrounding his view and the tender wind, gentle as the wings of butterflies, dulled somewhat the noise in his ears. Despite the still incoming data that flooded his mind like a tsunami, he could still appreciate the contentment and the sensation of flying alone through the silent sky. Oren knew, as he knew everything else, that this was the way the wizard had left the land of Oz. But he also knew there would be a violent interruption in the journey before he went on to join Leona on some other distant cosmic patch. Oren took a swig of gin from the bottle and then peered over the rim of the basket, ascertaining his correct course, and then pulled on the cord that opened the parachute valve at the top of the envelope. This released some of the hot air from the envelope, decreasing the inner air temperature and slowing the balloon's ascent. Oren saw that the slight wind flow was bringing him into exactly the position he wanted. His mind was slowly being overwhelmed by the flow of statistical data, abstractions, calculations, percentages, variables. He grimaced and fought off the interpretations and slowly began to replace their droning by recalling music like Georgia Kelly's Harp and Soul, which made his drifting through the clouds feel closer to heaven. But even the music began to be drowned out of his mind by the laws of motion and permutations, the science of this and that. He knew that soon he would not be able to think his own thoughts in any logical way, and he had to do the job at hand, and quickly. He reached slowly and unsteadily into his pocket and clasped his fingers around the Blackfire opal, felt the heat of it flowing into his hand. In spite of his changing form, he was glad that he could still feel. He brought it out of his pocket and stared at its shiny surface and the inner flame that glittered like spangles. He tried to think of Leona and where she might be. He tried to think of Rafe and Jordan and Cody, of their life together. But all he could hear in his mind was a mixture of poetry, and though like Pascal, he desired certainty above all things, he really knew that absolute certainty can never be achieved, and he would settle for what Bernoulli called moral certainty, or being as sure as you can be about anything. Oren raised the opal above his head, aiming it at the balloon envelope. Suddenly a beam of black fire emanated from the jewel, shot like a laser into the propane-filled bag, It exploded above Orin with a shuddering blast and a furious swirl of black fire. As the flaming envelope consumed the multicolored balloon and the basket below, curling into an inferno that dropped down toward the Emerald City, Orin could hear the poetry in his mind more clearly now. There is a man in the land of Uz, he who needs so much love. He doubts whether he deserves to be loved. The pleasure is not worth the pain. The game is not worth the candle. If only, he cries, like in the Song of Brahms, if only he knew the dear way back to childhood. Chapter 107. Phlegethon, the river of boiling blood and fire, flaming sand with fiery flakes raining from the sky. The massive fireball that cascaded down on the resort was about to become something out of Dante's Inferno. What had been left of Orin, the priest, and the balloon basket, as well as the silky envelope, had incinerated into a fine, glowing, red-hot dust on the way down. Orin knew that would be the case, but he also knew that the opal would retain its form and power. On impact with the ground, it would ignite a superheated cloud of energy fuel and a hot, black mushroom of fire and smoke that would consume everything in its path. He was going for end of existence for Daniel and the Blackfire Resort, but he would settle for death and destruction. He had used the third eye of his pineal gland to generate an auto-ignition of energy and fire gases that were ordinarily benign within the jewel, but could be triggered for dreadful purposes. From all his accumulated data and knowledge, despite his failing mental capacities, Orin still had concluded that this was the only way he could possibly interrupt the means by which Daniel was attempting to corrupt both the spiritual and natural worlds, the implicate and explicate order, for his own devious purposes. Orin knew that people would be killed by the rapid-fire phenomena, but he was well aware that their deaths would only be transitioned to another cosmic patch, just like his own. He dimly hoped that Rafe managed to get Jordan and Cody to safety before the Holocaust, but knew that if he were unsuccessful, they too would be transformed to some other realm. This was not ordinary fire. It had begun as Greek fire and was a mysterious incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire in naval battles to great effect, as it could continue burning while floating on water. But its ingredients and the processes of manufacture and deployment of Greek fire were carefully guarded military secrets, lost forever. And while many attributed it to a mystical jewel of destructive occult powers, it continued to be a source of speculation to this day. A similar weapon was also used by the Arabs, the Chinese, and the Mongols, and much of the nature of its origins still remains a mystery. The thickening gelling agent, mixed with gasoline known as napalm and used as an incendiary device during the Vietnam War, was no mystery and was derived from chemical constituents like naphthenic and palmitic acid. But the conflagration generated by the enigmatic opal was closer to what old-time firefighters might refer to as black fire or hot, rich flashover, a high-volume, turbulent velocity, super-dense black smoke accompanied by extreme head. A black fire was all the bad things coming together at once. It consisted of thermal runaway that led to horrific flashover backdraft, where air enters and causes fireballs of erupting smoke explosions that were superheated fire gases mixing with air. This particular black fire explosion, however, was not hot, rich flashover or anything old-timers would recognize, but it was definitely all bad things coming together at once. It was an aggressive, brutal, and flammable pyrolysis that agitated at all levels and transuded its way through steel and stone to wood and timber. Its belching intensity escalated and became a sea of black flames, adhering to surfaces of buildings and flesh. like napalm. The initial convulsion had disgorged into the street just outside the main casino, and there were a few people caught in the immediate explosion and destructive force who were screaming and running, arms torn from their bodies, hair and clothing burning furiously. The infrastructure of the elegant buildings began to shatter and splinter as they were engulfed by the fierce heat. Metal, glass, composites began to liquefy and flow into the streets, churning them into the real Dante's Phlegethon, the river of boiling blood and fire, flaming sand with fiery flakes raining from the sky. People who fell from the steps into the street from the trembling that was like an earthquake were instantly reduced to ashes. The seismic tremors increased and ruptures began to form in the streets, the black flow pouring into dark and seemingly bottomless pits. Cars, lampposts, shrieking people were sucked down into the vortexes. Charlie Famous had led Cody out of the casino, and they were on the handicap ramp as the nightmare of Blackfire had begun to destroy the resort that carried its name. Charlie was still using his human arm and hand, half dragging the boy who continued to resist and sob. "No, let go. I can't leave without my mom," Cody cried as he tried to pull away from Charlie's tight grip. He flailed around with his legs and attempted to entangle one of his feet in the curves of the wrought iron side rails along the ramp. Charlie's lights flashed wildly. He was becoming confused and disturbed by the destruction surrounding them. His digital voice was more erratic and desperate. I couldn't save my own life, Cody, but I can save yours." It was then that Cody managed to hook one of his feet in the iron railing, but the pressure twisted his ankle and there was an audible snapping sound as Charlie continued to pull him down the ramp. Cody screamed in pain and Charlie stopped, his lights blinking madly. The boy's screams suddenly seemed to make Charlie more aware of just where he had been heading. The street below him was no longer solid stone cobbles. It was a dark river of fire and steam whose deadly edges were slowly inching up the very ramp on which they had been proceeding. Tiny splashes of inky hot pitch lapped up the ramp toward Charlie's base. The machine realized in this moment that he could not proceed any further down the ramp, and he could not go back up because Cody's foot was caught in the railing. He tried to pull Cody back up toward the casino entrance, but the boy shrieked in pain. "My foot, Charlie, my foot!" Cody sobbed. He was in great pain and unable to move. Charlie's lights blinked and flashed in incomprehensible patterns. He began to rock back and forth slightly, holding Cody's hand in a kind of helpless uncertainty. The turbulent waves from the encroaching river of scalding pitch were swiftly eating away at the ramp and unbalancing Charlie's stability sensors. Charlie slowly released the boy's wrist as he tottered more and more, recognizing that he was unable to control himself and was inexorably falling backward toward the black pitch and total annihilation. There was a poignant sound to his digital voice, a sadness that made Cody look up at him fearfully. "Don't forget me, Cody," said Charlie Famous. "Charlie, no!" screamed Cody, but he could do nothing. The one-armed bandit toppled over like a tree in a heavy wind. Fire and steam engulfed him, and in an instant, he was gone. Cody sobbed in shock and horror, and then quickly realized he was in terrible danger because he was now alone and trapped. The steaming pitch was edging closer to him, and he was unable to move. His fractured ankle was lodged into the wrought iron, and he could only stare at the rippling waves of fiery ooze creeping closer and closer. It was then that Cody heard a human voice. "Is anybody there? I can't see! I can't see!" Chapter 108. Cody saw the figure of a man stumbling toward him, and he called out, "Over here! I'm over here!" Miguel's head turned toward the sound, and he reached out with his hands, managed to grasp the wrought iron railing as he felt his way forward. He was still wearing the carnival costume, but he was obviously quite human once again. His scarred eyes that had become so black were now their normal deep brown. His lean Chicano face that had become fierce and malignant was now almost serene. The change had come again through violence that had awakened existing post-traumatic disorder. The earlier fireworks had brought him back, and so had the explosions around him when the opal had hit the ground. The earlier memories had flooded into his mind. Flying debris, smashed windshield. The Humvee flipped onto its side across the sand and hit another mine, was blown back into the air. The firestorm and havoc that had rained down into the resort was causing mass destruction, but the powerful memories and experiences that Miguel had suffered in Afghanistan had once more been aroused, stimulated, and somehow driven out the inhuman being that had taken over his mind and body. Staggered and bleeding badly from face and chest, limping to nowhere, eyes a pulpy mess. He could no longer see with the eyes of the being occupying him, but he could not deny the relief that his blindness signified, a freedom from the corrupting influence that he had known was there, but could not resist or expel. He had suddenly found himself free, though blind again, and wandering in the darkness with the sounds and smells of disaster all around him. Yet there was a greater sense of peace than he had known for a long time. He had no idea where he was going or how he could possibly avoid being struck by falling debris or incinerated by the intense heat he could feel smothering him. But deep within Miguel was the simple and powerful conviction that somehow he was going to survive. It was a sense of faith and resolve that he had lost somewhere along the way, but was now strong inside him. "Where are you, kid? Keep talking," he yelled out, having recognized that the voice he had heard was a very young boy. "Over here," came the answer. "Keep coming down the railing." Okay, keep talking. I'm blind, but I can hear you." That's it, you're close to me. My foot, it's stuck and I think it's broke." Miguel kept grabbing at the iron and he couldn't help but be aware that his fingertips were experiencing something new and strangely exciting. It wasn't just heat from the flames. It was almost electric. The touch of the iron stimulated him in an entirely different way than he could even explain to himself. It was as if the hard, inanimate substance had a life inside it, an energy he had never felt before, and it was flowing into his fingertips and into his very being like some living force that was communicating to him and telling him exactly where to go. In seconds, he was touching Cody's entangled foot. "That's it! That's me!" cried the boy, a new sense of hope in his small voice. "Okay, I've got it. I can feel it. Now does this hurt?" Miguel had Cody's foot in his hand, gently trying to work it free from the bars of iron. "Ow!" Cody cried, but he gritted his teeth and urged Miguel on. "It's all right. Go ahead." Slowly, with his sensitive fingers, Miguel worked the boy's foot from the bars. Cody moaned slightly as his tortured ankle was released, but he suppressed it as much as he could. He was 10 years old. He was tough like his mom. There was something very soothing in Miguel's touch, and the pain diminished very quickly. "Thanks," Cody murmured gratefully. "Hey, listen, we got to get out of here, and fast. Can you see any way for us to go?" Cody glanced quickly around. "Well, there's a pathway by the building, but my mom's still inside. We got to help my mom and Rafe." Miguel could feel the boy's body now, and he hunkered down next to him. "Can you walk at all, kid?" Cody tried to stand, but the pain was too much, and he cried out. I can't," he sobbed. Okay. Well, listen to me. Now, we can help each other. I can walk, and you can see. Now, can you climb on my back?" I'll try." Cody started to reach out toward Miguel, but he stopped as he spotted something lying near him in a pile of dark ash and debris. It was a small, round stone with a black, shiny surface. Cody stared at it for a second, fascinated by what seemed to be something sparkling deep inside it. Even in this moment of desperation, he couldn't resist his desire to add this strange rock to his collection. "Hurry, kid," urged Miguel as he sensed the boy's hesitation. Cody quickly reached out and snatched the stone, felt the sudden heat from it, almost dropped it, but managed to hold on and thrust it swiftly into his pocket. Then Cody reached out and grabbed Miguel, who was crouched down low beside him. He struggled, hobbled by his fractured ankle, but managed to finally scramble up onto Miguel, piggyback style, legs around his waist, arms and hands clutching at him, and then wrapped around his neck. "Hang on tight." Tell me which way to go, okay? Well, follow the rail back up to the entrance. Miguel began to retrace his steps back up toward the entrance of the casino, but as they got closer, he could feel the fierce heat radiating from inside. No way, kid, it's burning like hell in there. But my mom's inside. We'll have to go around, find some other entrance. Where's that pathway? Left, go left, Cody sobbed. Miguel turned to his left, began to make his way along the path next to the building, Cody watching and giving him directions. Hey, we make a great team, kid, yelled Miguel over the din of falling debris. My name isn't Kid, Cody answered with some indignation. It's Cody. Glad to know you, Cody. I'm Miguel. Miguel stretched his hands out in front of him, his fingers trembling and sensing the air like antennae or the tongue of a snake. He remembered how he had seen and what he had seen when that inhuman presence had taken over his mind and body. It was good to see, even with someone else's eyes, but the very nature of what he had seen was distorted and grotesque. It was from the perspective of some inhuman being seeing something totally different, a different dimension. The images he had seen were of a misshapen world, cruel and bizarre. It had even eclipsed the brutality of the war and all that he had been through because it was a world of hopelessness, and the beings had no purpose other than the experience of wallowing in their own repulsive venality. It had been his world for the time he had been allowed to see, and now he was blind again, and somehow all his other senses had become heightened and more acute. Was it because of that experience, or in spite of it? He didn't know why, but he could now sense how to avoid the hottest spots, and somehow he seemed able to know if debris was about to strike he and Cody. He could move out of its way, even without warnings from the boy. It was like a sixth sense, an awareness he had never known before. It seemed to be compensation for his loss of sight, and he was exulting in it because he felt the weight of the boy on his shoulders in both a physical and metaphorical sense, and somehow knew that now he was seeing beyond anything he had ever known before, that now he was seeing with his heart. It was an awakening, an epiphany like finding God. Miguel was certain now that he would somehow make his way back to his sister Maria's dime store yellow house among the fig trees and old cars. Cody directed him along the pathway, amazed at the way the man seemed to instinctively avoid dangerous falling pieces of the building. Cody called out to Miguel like the digital voice from a GPS device, and they moved slowly but steadily forward. Cody glanced back only once, and in that moment remembered the slot machine named Charlie Famous, who had also tried to help him. Charlie had said that he was once a real human being, and Cody couldn't help but think of it as a kind of reverse Pinocchio, and that he would indeed always remember him with all his flashing lights and his one real arm. He could feel the heat from the stone in his pocket, and he knew that it was coming from something hidden inside the jewel, rather than from the hot ashes in which he had discovered it. It continued to be a source of curiosity as he clung to Miguel's back and shouted directions to him. Cody slowly released one of his arms and dug deep down into his pocket. He couldn't resist looking at the stone again. He could feel the other items in his pocket and managed to retrieve the stone from where it had ensconced itself inside the netting of the Pomo Dreamcatcher. Cody held the Blackfire opal in the palm of his hand and stared deep into its sparkling depths. He had no idea of how it was enchanting him, but he knew that it was. It was just like the soothing touch of his mother's hand just before he went to sleep. It was radiating some kind of warmth into his hand, right up his arm, into his body, and into his mind. It was something very powerful that Cody didn't understand, and yet was grateful for its presence. But could this small stone help them to find his mother and Rafe? There was definitely something in its nature and substance that made him feel more hopeful. Chapter 109. The first shockwaves hit only moments after our kiss. With fear and terror just beginning to pervade our combined consciousness, Jordan and I ran from the Table 18 room like bats out of hell toward the casino's main lobby. The heat was growing more intense. The walls were pulsing cherry red from some unseen heat source as we raced by. Steam was hissing and billowing under door frames as the floor clattered in a steady beat, almost hypnotic. But our eyes were burning with something else, a determination that was holding our gut panic in check. It was the most terrifying thing either of us had ever done. And that was saying something in this godforsaken place. Jordan was starting to hyperventilate, and she was soaking with sweat. Her fingers were slick and slippery on frantic and frightened guests as she pushed past them in search of Cody. Up ahead, through the parting mass of gamblers and employees, the vast lobby. It was dark and swirling with white-hot steam, with a strange glow visible here and there. How do you describe hell other than it was fucking hell? The air itself was vibrating with a kind of heat distortion. I mean, you could literally see the air changing, darkening and dying. The entire casino groaned as slot machines and other machinery whined and throbbed. It was like the beating of a vast heart, with the pounding of diminishing life somewhere echoing through the resort. Jordan and I moved from the long corridor, knuckles white on each other, into the once magnificent lobby. Our eyes darted, straining to penetrate the lethal gloom for any sign of Cody. We were both blinking sweat out of our eyes, moving through the swirling steam of the casino maze. We approached the middle with flashing firelights, illuminating the insane and ancient water fountain, which was collapsing in a thunderous roar and shriek of shattered stone and tile. Hundreds of gallons of water were gushing from its complex platform and intricate waterways, cascading down to the floor. Waves of irrigant slammed into the Art Deco furniture, quickly and forcefully tangling sofas, chairs, and tables against the remaining columns and walls. That's where all the steam was coming from, I thought. All the released water was evaporating into superheated mist. Once it came into contact with the intense temperature of the floor, it was the opposite of a volcano's hot lava plunging into a cool ocean, but with the same results. The huge glass walls and vast skylighted ceiling were cracking from the heat, shattering into a million pieces and crumbling to the marble floor. The sparkling French chandelier swayed back and forth, pulling on its ceiling support anchor until it ripped loose and crashed violently to the ground. Its colored prisms fired in different directions like bullets from a high-caliber handgun. People running like scared ants were pierced by the flying shards of glass, horribly departed before they even hit the floor. All the great columns and elaborate fixtures were being roughly violated, smashing into the walls and collapsing into twisted heaps of plaster and metal and glass. Even the huge ornate gilt-framed paintings and photos mounted on the walls, including the large portrait of Daniel Corinthus, were burning and melting and sliding down the walls from the black inferno. The last we saw of Corinthus's charming aspect were those strangely sinister eyes fusing together in blistering paint and fire. Even the gigantic floor-to-ceiling glass walls were cracking, shattering and crumbling to the luxurious marble flooring. Everything was being destroyed. Did Oren really do this? Was this what he wanted the Opal for? I couldn't think. We just had to keep moving forward, trembling and adrenalized like a couple of injured antelope running from a pack of hungry wolves. We could see skeletal figures melted against the 1,000-degree walls, frozen in macabre, tormented positions like humans in amber. Steam kept blasting us, blinding us, but nothing short of death was going to stop us. As we staggered toward the huge glass front entrance, avoiding falling bits of plaster and burning vapor, we searched desperately for any signs of Cody, but he was nowhere to be found. How could he possibly survive this, I thought. Then again, Cody was tougher than most. Having died already once and come back from the dead, he wasn't exactly your average 10-year-old. Rafe, what do we do? He's not down here. Maybe he's back in your room. We'll never make it up there. The whole place is falling apart. What's happening? There wasn't time to explain to Jordan all that I knew and all that I didn't. I just knew that I had to find Cody and get us the fuck out of here before it was too late. That's when things got really bad. Suddenly, a concussion rocked the casino like an earthquake, jarring everyone in the lobby almost off their feet. Then there was another, The whole resort seemed to shudder. The screams of guests began to wail even louder in a demented rhythm. If ever there was a moment when all hope was gone, it was then, disintegrated into mindless chaos. Jordan and I stumbled toward the elevators, blindly, with panting intensity verging on hysteria. The casino continued to be rocked with explosions, lights flashing, steam blasting, red-hot steel hissing, a mass of debris falling from the high ceilings. We sprinted toward the entrance as the foundations of this impossible world were shaking apart. Stunned and helpless, I tried desperately to hold Jordan, but as the floor beneath our feet trembled and rolled, she was torn from my grasp and hurtled away from me. "Jordan!" I screamed as she all but flew away, her arms outstretched toward me, her face reflecting her terror. Heat was suddenly even more pervasive and overwhelming. The floor buckled below us with the titanic force of some underworld creature trying to hurl itself above ground. I could see dark and dense smoke beginning to surge from the huge fissures in the floor, as if great pressure was forming on the underside. In that instant, as I struggled to maintain my balance and rush toward Jordan, I was aware that this resort was in its death throes. It was Oren and the Blackfire opal, and it was fear that I saw in Daniel's face as he left the Table 18 room. We had seconds to get out of here, or it was over for both of us. But I was stumbling badly and could only thrash about mindlessly, trying to grab something stable to maintain my balance. I could hear screams in the distance that mingled with the sounds of shattering glass and the implosion of plaster and wood and metals. There was the unmistakable crackling of flames all around me. Walls and ceilings suddenly were also arrayed with fissures, bluish-black flowers of fire erupting through the rendered openings. At the same time, I was thrown bodily to the floor as it was being ripped apart beneath me. Huge fireballs swelled up through the cracks in the floor as everything bucked wildly. Behind us and all around us, the lobby was disappearing in the unimaginable darkness of a black fireball, igniting everything in sight with a fury. The air vibrated with intense heat waves and concussion. I could see everything shaking into a blur. Suddenly, a last single sun-hot dome of crushing energy burst up through the floor. The last thing I saw was a glimpse of Jordan as she vanished into a swirl of thick black smoke and fire, a wall tumbling down on top of her, encompassing her in a cascade of stone and dust. "Jordan!" I cried out again through the roar of calamity. And then I became suddenly aware of that strange and overwhelming vertigo. My head began to spin. Everything was whirling around, and something else. There it was again, that odd sensation deep inside my mind that I had felt before, just prior to traveling through space and time. Then there was darkness.